Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for folks to join us. Hope everybody is, if you're joining us from Ontario or other snowy parts, that everybody's safe and doing well. This apparently record-breaking snowfall in Toronto. We have quite a few people joining, so it'll just take a few minutes before we formally start.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who's just joined. We're just giving a few minutes because we know that we've got quite a few people in the waiting room still who are just being let in. Okay. All right. I think we're ready to start. I know that probably there'll still be some more folks joining us as we get into the conversation today. So welcome everyone. My name is Marina Morrow, and I'm a professor here in the School of Health Policy and Management at York University, and the director of the Mad Studies Hub. And just by way of visual description, I'm an older white woman with blonde hair, and I'm wearing kind of multicolored cardigan that's black and brown and white. Rachel De Silveira Gorman, who's a professor in critical disability studies in the school, and I are really excited to have you all with us this afternoon for a discussion of accessibility in the post-secondary sector with a focus on the experiences and needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color students in the Canadian context. We have two very special guests this afternoon. We have Dr. Nabi Denoda and Dr. Frederick Fauvet, who will be introduced properly momentarily. As most of you know, this event is sponsored by the Mad Studies Hub here at York. The Mad Studies Hub is a newly formed research unit that brings researchers, activists, and advocates together in collaborations related to research, education, and knowledge mobilization that center Mad lives and experience. The hub operates both virtually and in person, and we've been rapidly expanding our membership beyond York and internationally. And shortly, I will post in the chat information about the hub itself and how you can get involved. Before I go over our time together and so the agenda for our time together, I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement. And since we're not all gathered in the same space or location, I really invite you all to reflect and honor the territory on which you are located today. So York University is the traditional territory, of course, of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tikaronto has been caretaken historically by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home, of course, to many Indigenous peoples, and I wanted to acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I also wanted to tell people that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I say the land acknowledgement as a reminder for myself and for others to commit and recommit to decolonizing practices and support for land repatriation. So for our program today, Professor Rachel De Silveira Gorman will be acting as our host. They will be introducing our special guests, Dr. Navi Denoda and Dr. Frederick Fauvet. But I wanted to just introduce Rachel briefly. Rachel, as I mentioned, is a professor in the school whose work and teaching focuses in the area of critical disability studies. They work in dance theater, performance, and curating, and their research is interdisciplinary, drawing from fine arts, humanities, and sciences. Rachel has also been a tireless advocate at York and beyond for student accessibility and for disability justice. So we're very grateful to them for agreeing to facilitate this discussion. So just before I hand things over to Rachel and our guests, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I wanted to let people know that we're going to plan to sort of hold questions to the end of the session. But we really encourage you to post comments in the chat, to post your questions in the chat. Both Rachel and myself will be monitoring the chat. I also wanted to invite people, if you've got, hoping people know that they can turn on the closed captions at any time, that if you have any accessibility needs, please just send me a note in the chat and I can support you. We also are recording the session, and we record it in order to be able to mount it on our website. So just to let you know that we are being recorded. So I think those are my main housekeeping notes. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Marina, and welcome everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so excited for this launch. I am joining you from Treaty 13 territory, Tekaronto. Visual description, I'm a non-binary mixed race person with olive skin and dark hair. Marina mentioned transcripts. The closed captioning is there, and I believe we're going to move into PowerPoints in a second, and that will also have transcription, I think. I'm going to go over the bios for our guests, and then we'll move into first Navi's presentation of the guide, and then Frederick having some critical discussion about BIPOC access. After that, I'm going to have a couple of just follow-up questions for the panel, and then we're going to really look to the chat for any comments, questions. There's a lot of experience in the room around doing, and you know, our guests really want to make sure this is a discussion because this is about moving the whole field forward and sharing our struggles and our best practices. And I think, yeah, so if you want to also look in the chat, Marina's just posted the BIPOC Student Guide to Accessibility, which is Navi's beautiful work, life's work, something that emerged out of Navi's dissertation and a decade of work. And then as you can see with Marina's note in the chat, you can get, if you want slides, you can get them as well. So that's my kind of overview of what's happening. I'm so excited about this. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Navi Denoda, who's famous here at York and in critical disability studies for lots of great advocacy work and lots of brilliant scholarship. And I'm very proud to have been around adjacent as Navi's developed this work. Navi Denoda has drawn on her lived experience as a BIPOC person in post-secondary education to shape their research, policy, and consultation work on issues of access and disablement. They hold a PhD in critical disability studies from York University. In 2016, Navi collaborated with the Ontario Human Rights Commission to develop new guidelines for post-secondary accessibility services in the hopes of creating better access for BIPOC students. And I have to say, like, Navi's work, this advocacy work changed things dramatically and had a huge impact. Like, in really, that was the beginning of Navi's career. To start, you kind of started at something that I haven't had that much impact in my career so far. Their doctoral research centered BIPOC students and accessibility advisors, identifying best practices for delivering accommodations through a disability justice lens. This work has culminated in the BIPOC Student Guide to Accommodation, and you can link to that in the chat. Please do. It's there to be used and circulated. So this guide is designed to foster community and dialogue in the accommodation process. Navi has a decade of experience working as an accessibility advisor in post-secondary institutions, so both universities and polytechnics in Canada and in the US. And now I'm going to, Navi's going to, so keep that in mind, Navi's going to speak first, but I'm also going to read Frederick's bio as well, so we can go from one presentation into the next. So we're also delighted to have Frederick Fauvet. Frederick's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education and Social Work at Thompson Rivers University. He has previously held faculty positions at the University of Prince Edward Island and Royal Roads University. He has also been head of accessibility services at McGill University for a period of 4 years for the duration of his PhD. He was responsible in this role for the campus-wide rollout of Universal Design for Learning Strategies, UDL. Frederick acts as a UDL and inclusion consultant domestically and internationally in the K-12 and post-secondary sectors. Frederick was the instigator of and the program chair for the 3 first Pan-Canadian conferences on UDL, which took place in Montreal, Charlottetown, and Victoria in 2015, 2017, and 2019, respectively. He's been a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Disability and Social Justice since 2020. Think about maybe submitting to that journal. And has joined the editorial executive of the journal in 2023. So I would now love to welcome Navi Denoda to share your screen. And again, so there'll be a PowerPoint. And if you want to look at the guide, click in the chat. Welcome, Navi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. I feel so honored that we can all collectively get together in this space. I know that there's so much important intention in attending and talking about this and carving out the space. So I really appreciate you coming here, lending your ear to my presentation, and I'm very excited to be able to contribute to the dialogue after and the Q&A. The BIPOC Student Guide to Accommodations is a culmination of research that I did during my doctoral degree, where I spoke to BIPOC students and BIPOC accessibility advisors across Ontario about their experiences. And so this is a culmination of their contributions and their time. A lot of this information for BIPOC students is not going to be new necessarily. I'm just elucidating these ideas. And the idea is to bridge the gap between how equity is considered in the Disability Service Office. So I'm committed to continuing this work beyond this handbook, because I know that there's a lot of work to do here. So this is just a slice of that. Outcomes for today. Oh, I forgot to do an image description. I'd like to pause for a second to do that. I'm a South Asian, genderqueer presenting person. I have black wavy hair today and some dark lipstick and kind of like a floral background going on. And I'm like a early middle-aged person. Um, I today am going to try to bring you these outcomes. One is adding a disablement perspective to the ways that the Disability Service Office operates to expand biomedical definitions. We're going to talk about BIPOC student identity and accommodations when accessing the Disability Service Office. Also, we're going to talk about how the accommodation process itself is not a neutral process. Best practices and examples of how BIPOC accessibility advisors provide nuanced accommodation recommendations to shine a light on how intersectional perspectives are applied without the frameworks or institutional support that exists yet to support them. Then I'm also going to offer and consider some new frameworks in assessing equity from a BIPOC lens throughout the accommodation life cycle, through the concepts of the accommodation differential and differential of entitlement. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And then also, you can walk away with this idea of what the language of access is as a gold standard of BIPOC student experience, which is supporting student navigation throughout the post-secondary institution, and how the Disability Service Office can address that. 10 years later, why remove diagnosis and registration forms? In 2016, I was successful in partnering with the Ontario Human Rights Commission to remove the requirement for students to disclose a diagnosis when registering for supports. And this came out of my lived experience as a student with disabilities. I registered for accommodations for the first time in post-secondary, and the first time around I had never received a diagnosis before, and I was directed by my disability service office to go and get a diagnosis in order to register. So the first time around, the way I described my experiences didn't warrant a diagnosis itself, and I was denied accommodations. And from that, I appealed because I knew that the impacts I was experiencing was significant, but it somehow wasn't reflected in my ability to get a diagnosis, to get access. And so like diagnosis ended up being this gatekeeper for me to get access. And then ultimately, I appealed. I went to a psychiatrist and learned how to describe my experiences in a way that would warrant diagnosis. And so I left having 2 or 3 sessions with a psychiatrist on my campus and leaving with a list of diagnoses. Though I think that I did require mental health support, the issue here is that instead of focusing on functional limitation, it was very much focused on receiving a diagnosis in order to get supports. And so I understood as a BIPOC person why that was problematic, and it ended up leading me down a line of receiving support, psychiatric support that I wasn't informed or didn't have the support and understanding how to utilize in a way that served me. Yeah, so by removing diagnosis, my hope was that other BIPOC students would be able to access registering for accommodations without having to have a diagnosis. And we were successful in also implementing interim accommodations, which is the idea that you don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis, but that the post-secondary institution has a requirement to provide supports to students as they're in the process of that. And so I wanted to open up space for BIPOC students to access without receiving a diagnosis, but also provide space for them to bring more of their identity and experience. From my research, I understood that there's a lack of BIPOC-centered support or definitions for what BIPOC-centered support is in the Disability Service Office. That BIPOC students, their identity is not captured in the biomedical definitions of disability entirely. And for the Disability Service Office, though from an institutional perspective, there are definitions for what equity is, when we go into the Disability Service Office, there's a lack of definition of how to apply that equity lens or what the deliverables should be in order to meet those things. And so I set out to get the research and to provide some information back so we can better support BIPOC students and have more BIPOC-centered support. So I will talk more about what disablement is, but how if nothing else, how disablement needs to be added to our understanding of the BIPOC experience in the Disability Service Office. That for the most part, 85% of BIPOC students are using accommodations for the first time in post-secondary education. And so this provides insight into how the Disability Service Office has to approach and support these students. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the accommodation process throughout the life cycle is not a neutral experience, and how we need to create an equity lens in each of those steps to and close the gap for BIPOC students so they can have a more holistic experience of the accommodation process. Disability and disablement. I owe a lot of my a theoretical framework to Rachel, who's been working on elucidating the BIPOC and racialized experience in post-secondary. And so Rachel's idea of disablement has formed the foundation of my work, but also should be an integral part of the way that we close the gap between, and I think Frederick's going to talk about this a little bit more, the way that we close the gap between the way we talk about disability and disablement in the academic context and how that's employed practically in the disability service office. So disability, or the disabled, are those whose formal relationship to the state enable them to claim benefits. So we can think about this about people who are entitled or privileged or understand themselves as within the biomedical definitions of disability, while others, oftentimes, and I'm adding this to Rachel's concept, oftentimes being the racialized subject, especially in my conversation here today, will have similar embodied experiences, but continue to work through injury and illness or languish without benefits or status. And so this points to the data that I received that oftentimes BIPOC people don't identify as being served by the Disability Service Office because they are not provided or the privilege of taking on these identities within a biomedical framework. I'm going to talk more about the 85% and why that's important in a moment. What I found is that there are little to no policies or processes in place in the Disability Service Office from those participants I spoke to that specifically speak to equity and how to serve BIPOC communities. And so that's a very big gap in biomedical and disablement that needs to be closed. And from us coming together today, I think is a commitment and a call to action that we're no longer moving forward without the integration of disablement in our conceptions of disability in the Disability Service Office. Disability is no longer enough. When I spoke to students, Shayani spoke to her understanding her identity of BIPOC identity in the Disability Service so well. So I'm just going to speak to that. I see my diagnosis as something that gives me access, and I narrativize it as such, even though I need accommodations because of mental health stuff, because of chronic pain stuff, but also because this just constantly feels like this institution is not built for me. Here we see how Shayani feels that their experience is intersectional, that there's areas of their identity that they're cognizant that they lose when they have to access disability supports. They have to frame their experiences in a specific way because it's not necessarily invited. And so as they're entering these processes, they know that disability is something that they have to take on in the institutional definition, but not something that reaches and provides them the opportunity to bring themselves to. So Shayani is doing that work. Tara talks about this, their experience as well. I think accommodations caused a combination, seeking accommodations. I think it caused a combination of weird guilt and shame about needing to get accommodations, but also guilt for being sort of questioned on whether or not I actually needed them because it made me feel like my integrity is being questioned a little bit, which I didn't love. I think this speaks to the need for disability service offices to be recognizing this gap in as the student experience of navigation, how students are experiencing the recommendation of accommodation from the Disability Service Office, and how we can continue to provide support to BIPOC students as they're leaving because they have this nuanced understanding of who they are within the institution. Accommodations are not a neutral process for BIPOC students. I found that, for instance, throughout the accommodation life cycle, I found that even registering for accommodations and going to a doctor to request documentation, a third of BIPOC students had a positive experience, a third had a neutral experience, and a third had a negative experience. So when we are in the Disability Service Office, advising students that they need to register for services, how are we providing we should be integrating a perspective of knowing that BIPOC students are going to potentially experience things like medical gaslighting when we're pushing them through this process, and how are we informing them how to talk about what they're experiencing. And again, it's this teaching, this entitlement of how certain people know to speak about their experience and how others are not coming. And my research shows BIPOC students are receiving this for the receiving accommodations for the first time. How are we supporting them through that process in an informed way? We also, because disability no longer is the only definition for registration that can be accepted, we need to go beyond the biomedical model if we're going to say we are providing conscientious, equitable, reflexive service. There are little to no policies and processes for alternative avenues for registration. When I spoke to BIPOC accessibility advisors, this work was being done between individuals who understood the need for alternative processes. So maybe it's subjective to a specific manager receiving these, which is a beautiful thing, but we need to create policies and processes so we can invite students in. It can't be a fringe thing that happens. We also need to advise that students have avenues to who might have medical trauma, for instance. What are those alternative avenues for registration for them? Maybe provide. I'm going to talk more about interim accommodations and how that can work. And then I'm going to read from Zara's experience of racism and ableism. We, as racialized persons and disabled people, we're going to experience racism and ableism at the same time. It's just something we can't prove, but you have to be aware of the attitude. I was aware of the attitudes that I experienced from professors. That's not ableism, but it's not racism. But sometimes it's ableism at the same time, just connected together. It's embedded. So sometimes it can be very frustrating. But when it comes to accommodations, you really have to tie it down to the ableism, that this is ableism rather than saying this is racism, because sometimes racism cannot help the situation because accommodation offices are for accommodations. So I have to be very strategic about how I organize my argument and how do I come together when Zara is trying to receive support from their disability service office. And so this highlights when we know BIPOC students are going to be experiencing racism and ableism together, how does the Disability Office address intersectional complaints reports from students? How do we support students, and how do we support accessibility advisors in addressing these issues in an institutional framework? Accessibility advisors. BIPOC accessibility advisors brought lived experience to their work that can't be replicated and should not, but does shine a light on the ways that intersectionality can be considered in practice. BIPOC accessibility advisors were providing nuanced intersectional recommendations that considered the experience of BIPOC students based on lived experience, even when they felt limited by their framework or by the policies and guidelines of their higher ed institution. Again, there's little to no formal policy or process for BIPOC specific intake practices or perspectives. Most work was done interpersonally between critically engaged managers, directors, accessibility staff. BIPOC accessibility advisors had an awareness about how the importance of interim accommodations to provide procedural access, or that access which would be accepted. It created a framework for understanding intersectionality, and the lived experience that they had brought the lived experience that they had informed their understanding of the importance of intersectional analysis and providing interim accommodations, because they understood the ways that and the barriers to registration process for BIPOC students. Also, BIPOC accessibility advisors created relationships with BIPOC students where they shared lived experience and taught about language of access to close the gap between those that are privileged to know navigation. And this conversation became a critical strategy for institutional navigation, work that's often not recognized by the Disability Service Office formally, but work that's integral to survival for BIPOC students. I want to talk about Eli. Eli was an accessibility advisor who said, "I know what it's like to be a Black student, navigating space and feeling like you constantly have to overachieve. That is empirical, that oftentimes my students have to have higher achievement. I know all of those things. When you come in and I say, 'How are you?' It's an unwritten thing and almost like a look on the face. It's to put it into words. It's a check-in. It's an acknowledgement of those things." And BIPOC students, BIPOC accessibility advisors are experiencing these environments every day without recognition from institutions, without policies or processes. And so my hope in creating the term differential of entitlement is to put it into conversation. Differential of entitlement is the idea that marginalized students of all orientations are disproportionately disadvantaged from having equitable access to resources. Some are privileged to know how to access those resources, and others have disadvantage to accessing that. Aisha talks as another accessibility advisor that says, "I don't approach my work as a sort of us and them." And so saying, you know what, I hear ya. I walk with you from the other side of it as a staff, and just lending space for validity for BIPOC students. And so I want to bring this into conversation as well. And I propose the idea of the accommodation differential to be included in conversation about BIPOC student experience, but also to close the gap and create metrics, because BIPOC students, the accommodation differential identifies that BIPOC students are required to rely on certain aspects of their identity to qualify for accommodations, and minimize and erase other aspects of their identity. BIPOC students are aware of the aspects of personhood that are invited in, and more so acutely aware of the loss of identity as the price they have to pay for support. And it's our role in the Disability Service Office and the institution to start to keep metrics at each point of contact a student has with the Disability Service Office to be closing that gap. The language of access. I learned that the language of access has become the gold standard of what a good access support looked like for students. I want to share that with you as well. Mia said, "I had an amazing counselor or accessibility advisor. I really still keep in touch with her. She's fantastic. She didn't just teach me what I should be asking for, but how I should be asking for it. She sat down with me for one session. It was an hour and a half, and taught me how to approach the professor, how to speak about accommodation requests, and how to advocate for myself in a very diplomatic way." And Eli in accessibility described what I'm calling the language of access as. It's explaining to people what they're entitled to, that you're entitled to get the services, you're entitled to ask for help or to get a diagnosis. And like you said, it's almost, I shouldn't even be here. So whatever I get, I'm going to take. I don't want to push too hard, that type of stuff. And I get that kind of language. It comes up often. The language of access, or my proposal to employ the language of access, is something that we should think about when we're working, maybe as accessibility advisors or staff in the disability service office, as how would someone who is privileged or entitled or was familiar with navigating these different aspects of the accommodation process, what do they know? And how do we provide that information to create equitable access to service? I think about communication with faculty. We know when a student leaves the accommodation office, they go and request an extension, for instance. Some students might know how to create a contained and rights-based argument about it. BIPOC students might make that same argument, but be faced with microaggressions related to that. How do we give them the knowledge of how to utilize the supports in the disability service office if they were to receive that? How we're going to follow up on that. The idea of the language of access is teaching navigation, but also teaching navigation, not just asking for accommodations, but like a rights-based approach for the BIPOC student. Finally, I just have here some questions to consider, none that have to be answered today, but some takeaways maybe for you. I'm interested for BIPOC students. Should you like to speak to any of these things? How should supports for BIPOC students be integrated in the accommodation process? When did you feel most seen through the process? Where are the improvements needed? What barriers exist before you reached the disability or accessibility office? And how would you like to be involved in shaping policy? And finally, for accommodation staff who might be present, I'm curious to know, or maybe some takeaways for you. When students are successfully navigating the accommodation process, what experience, privilege, or knowledge do they bring? How is BIPOC community knowledge represented in policy and practice? What data is collected? And what important information is not being captured about BIPOC students? In what ways are institutional understandings of equity being applied in the Disability Service Office? How do we define those things? And on an individual level, what guidelines or frameworks support BIPOC considerations in your accommodation recommendations? Do you notice trends across programs or disciplines? And are these considerations addressed by your Disability Service Office? Are you supported in addressing these things? Okay, that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Navi. That was incredible. And I love the questions you asked at the end. I can't wait to get into more of a discussion about this. But before we do that, I invite Frederick to share his presentation.
Thank you very much. And first, I want to thank Nevi for your presentation, for the guide which you are launching today as well, and for your lived experience, because I use the press coverage on your HRC complaint like throughout my courses, and I think it's still very up to date in showing lots of issues with both accessibility, but also the complaints process within Canada, etc. And you've led by example there, so really thank you again for all that. In terms of description, I'm a middle-aged older guy with no hair, wearing a blue shirt and a mustard jumper today. And my pronouns are he, him. Thanks again for the introductions as well at the beginning. You talked about the UDL conference. I'm just going to do a little plug here. Now, we are thinking of launching the next one in 2027. There was a long break there because of COVID, but keep looking at social media, and we are about to announce something. So there's another one coming up soon. So let me share my slides, and then we will go from there. Go to the full. Right, so I come to you today from the interior BC. We have no snow, and I sympathize for all of those who are cocooning in today. And I'm just going to do a quick, very short land acknowledgement, acknowledge that I work and play on the unceded, traditionally occupied territory of the Tecumseh, the Sequapim within Sequapim Hulu. Also mention that this is not just a matter of doing land acknowledgement, but it is a matter of bringing all of these conversations into reflections on inclusion accessibility within the higher ed sector. And those are conversations that are not intuitive or easy. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today, right? I'm also going to quick plug, but I'm editing a book at the moment called Decolonizing UDL, and I'm going to talk a little bit about UDL later on. And I think those efforts that we have to do to force these conversations should be part of all of our practice, etc., right? We can't continue to just look at the calls for actions and do our job in terms of accessibility and inclusion and not try and actually start to merge these perspectives. A little bit by my stances, just to the extent to which they are going to inform what I talk about today. So I have really different hats, different perspectives. I'm faculty, been faculty for 10 years now. And in that role, obviously, I teach a lot about accessibility and inclusion. That part's part of my teaching portfolio, but my research focuses on inclusion accessibility in both K-12 and post-secondary and UDL. And so we'll be talking about all that. Within that role, it's important to note that often faculty end up in a mentoring position because we are supporting contract faculty who may not necessarily know how to address inclusion, accessibility, etc. So there's that mentoring role there. I was as well head of the USD Office for Students with Disabilities at McGill while I was taking a break and doing my PhD. And that has really informed my thinking in terms of disability studies, but also in terms of some of the tension we'll talk about today, which is how to reconcile theory and practice, right? Disability studies and disability service provision as a practice, which often are very fragmented and very antagonistically positioned even. And finally, I do a lot of obviously research. At my last hat would be the research position, right? Looking at transformation and reform and moving forward, because I think it's one thing to see the tensions, but we also have to propose ways to move the sector forward. And that's what we'll have a chance to talk about today as well. So objectives not going to spend too long, but what I would say is that I'm going to be much more provocative than Navi, and I think my way of creating the slides was to create provocations for further discussions, right? So I didn't try in my presentation to nuance my ideas, and I think it is important in academia that we nuance what we say. But here the aim was not to nuance, but to maybe shake the boat a little bit, rock the boat, and see how we could have rich discussions about what needs to change and how quickly does it need to change. And obviously, I'll try and stop it at the hour so we have a good half hour for discussions, etc. So I'm going to talk to you, and I had to structure this. There are many things I wanted to talk on, and it will build up on Navi's presentation. But there are three things I thought about access in terms of structuring my reflection. So the first one was this notion that has been already discussed by Navi, the lack of intersectional work within accessibility in higher ed. And I will have a slide and give you some thoughts on that. And there I will draw mostly from my perspective as accessibility manager for that period and the work I still do in that field. But then I wanted to spend some time also thinking about, but what are some of the structural hindrances that actually mean that we're not changing and nothing is happening? And I think it's always important to get at ecological perspectives and not just to talk about what's not happening, but also look at why it's not happening. And then the few points there I want to make. And lastly, I did want to spend some time talking about UDL because I wanted to really stress the fact that although we talk about these tensions for BIPOC folks and intersectionality generally in accessibility, that is now transferring into even the transformative initiatives that we see, right? And I would argue that UDL faces exactly the same challenges. It places itself as a continuum. It should be a transformative continuum, but actually that continuum is not really addressing some of the tensions that we will be discussing today. And therefore, even UDL, etc., will need to have a hard look at intersectionality, the narratives of BIPOC folks and service users, etc. So in terms of the lack of intersectional approaches within disability service provision, we can again say with provocation that there's very little of that work going on. And it is going to be obviously problematic, and Navi has hinted with some of the life narratives and the story that she has collected, etc. But it is going to make BIPOC students feel uncomfortable when they're approaching disability service providers, because alternative formats are rarely explored, right? So whether it is that and there are many, and I just want to nod a lot of literature out there, right, which examines why, if you are indigenous folk who's already, 1,500 kilometers from your community, attending a university where endemic racism exists, are you likely to want to work in office when someone says, what is the issue that you are having? What is the barrier that you're having? You have been told to be bold and to be self-reliant and to be autonomous. And therefore, having to walk into a place where you are basically, from a deficit perspective, asked, what is it that you can't do, is not something that's going to come intuitively. And that goes across from all BIPOC folks. I think the whole model kind of requires a sort of defeat, right? That you walk into an office and say, it's not working for me. And we have to do something to change that. Some of the things we started looking at when I was at McGill can be very simple things. The feedback we were getting, for example, from my indigenous students was even the advisor model, right? You walk into a place and you sit at the table and you have to talk about the issues, etc. That was not congenial, and that they would much rather have these meetings, for example, at First People's House. And then we started exploring the notion of having a circle rather than one-on-one with the First Nations, First People's House representative that is supporting the students in that environment that they're familiar with, was much more congenial for students, much less antagonistic again, and much more congenial to what they would make them feel at ease about talking about, the challenges that we're facing. We're experimenting with these things while I was there. I would say as well, I'm going to take really an ecological perspective, that a lot of things I'm going to talk to you about that we experimented with at McGill have disappeared from McGill. And I think we also have to look at this notion that institutions have this pendulum, right? That however hard we try, the pendulum often swings back into status quo, right? And these initiatives disappear. And that is a problem on the longitudinal dimension, because we see initiatives and we see a bit of transformation, but we also see this ruthless sort of pendulum swing, which kind of raises that history and those initiatives. And even for students who are racialized, right? The fact that you may be receiving support from one area of the university because you feel racialized, etc., but that doesn't connect with the service provision at accessibility, right? And no one ever offers an invitation for it to happen somewhere different, or with different people at the table, or with people who might be bringing different perspective to what your service provision might look like, etc. So I think a lot of work to be done there. I also say that current quality assurance mechanism within disability service provisions are problematic because, and having been part of them for 4 years, we have kind of bought into this neoliberal, benchmarking that yes, we have to do quality assurance on service provisions, etc. But if you look at what we collect, we usually collect narratives from people who are within the accessibility service provision, who have successfully registered, who have successfully obtained the services that they like and have stayed on with the services. We don't collect evidence from the students who came and left because they didn't like the first point of contact, or the students who did not receive the accommodations that they wanted, or that felt it wasn't, culturally, ethnicity sort of congenial to be in that environment. And I've had the opportunity at one point when I was, in a manager to be an external review and accessibility center somewhere else. And the model there was different because I was given carte blanche, right? Talk to the student union, talk to the whole population, collect these narratives. And it can be quite scary when you collect the narratives of the students who have not been able to enter the system, who have been pushed away, etc. Again, a lot of what Nadine mentioned, intrusive sort of questions. The deficit model seems to just go to the power of 10 suddenly, right? When we're talking with folks that are actually dealing with other life stories, other narratives, other background, etc. I want to finish this and just saying that I think, and this is where the provocation is gonna lie, is that I think the accessibility world anyway needs to really shake itself to look at how uneasy it is with questions of race and ethnicity. In 2016, I started being interested in the hashtag disability to white because it echoed some of the challenges I was facing professionally. And I will tell you that I have never been as trolled online as during 2016 when I used that hashtag. And the trolling wasn't, my account at the time was very professional, only had connections with people in the profession, etc. I was being told from folks in the disability community, right? And that is an uncomfortable conversation that we are going to need to have. It hasn't gone away. And unfortunately, in an ideal world, we all work from critical perspectives and we should be able to do that intersectional work, but we're not. And that's a question for us today, right? How can we actually break this down? Um, Now, if we go to the reasons why, and I do want to spend a few minutes on this, well, the funding model is really problematic, right? I keep saying this, I've said it for 10 years. We can keep talking about transformation, about UNIL, about social model, but if your funding is inherently linked to biomedical approaches, you're not going to go anywhere, right? Because that is what the key, that's still the dollar sign that is leading every single other thing that we do in this environment. There's also the issue that training, hiring, and the benchmark qualifications within accessibility services is very hazy, right? We have folks coming from all sorts of places with all sorts of background, and quite a lot of these folks are coming in with biomedical backgrounds in training, etc. Right? A lot of I know from experience come from occupational therapy, etc. And we do have folks present from disability studies, but there's a clash there, and there's no desire at the present to standardize that background or find common grounds in terms of stances and theoretical approach. And it's not either, although I was talking to an Australian colleague recently where there seemed to be appetite for this notion of creating a micro-credentials, right? That maybe every accessibility folk should be exposed to the basics of the social model and certain, foundational disability studies work in terms of empowerment, etc., and voice and agency, to mean that we will have less fragmentation within the folks that work within these services. This to say as well that disability studies scholarships, unfortunately, is not permeating seamlessly into service provision. I remember when I was working as head of the USD at McGill, going to the Lancaster Disability Studies Conference, right, which is now no longer, but at the time was very big European disability studies conference, and a very famous scholar in disability studies looking at me and saying, "What do you do?" And I said, "I work at, the USD at McGill." And he looked at me and I always remember this, and he said, "Well, what are you doing here? We all know that disability service provision is not informed by literature theory, right?" Okay, well, there you have it. And this kind of resignation that we kind of think there's a fragmentation there and there's nothing that we can do about it. I think today is an opportunity to have those discussions about how we can change that, right? And how we can have much more connection between the scholarship and the practice. Fragmentation of service as well within our neoliberal, models is really problematic. We talk about intersectional work, but often the people, for example, who are working at the First People's House and people who work in accessibility are not organic, they're not supported, they're not easy to do. Again, the funding model anyway separates you because we have different budgets, etc. But also often there's no literally physical, water cooler discussions that can happen when these folks can come together and actually organically see how could we work together, etc. Think about the folks that support racialized students within the campus. They are rarely invited to conversations around accessibility and inclusion, etc. Think more widely about all, 25% of our campuses up to now have been international students, often BIPOC folks too. And the folks that support international students are never invited at the table with accessibility folks, etc. Right? So really, very simple structural barriers there that mean that the possibility or the windows for creating new models are not going to happen unless people talk to each other. And then if you look at the ecological lens again, I think there's issues with leadership, right? Because even if we talk about transformation, you talk about UDL or transformation of the funding model, because we have this setups that is so competitive and neoliberal between these agencies or these departments, and each has their own budget and they compete for budgets, etc., it becomes very territorial, right? So even when we talk about change, it really quickly becomes about who's leading the change and who's the change agent and who's going to have the visibility of being the change agent in this process. And I think there's a status quo that happens often because no one can agree, right? Who's going to take the lead and who's going to have the portfolio of doing this, etc. And that's to do with really our structures, right? It's all very well to say that we're going to function within our campus on this neoliberal model, but it creates tension as opposed to create collaboration. Now, finally, just very quickly to talk about how that tension is perpetuated. Everything we've discussed so far is being perpetuated even in transformative initiatives, particularly if we look at UDL, right, which is, I'm hoping, a model that would lead us into solving some of the issues we have when it comes to how tied accessibility services are linked to the biomedical model. So focusing on the system, focusing on teaching and learning, focusing on changing teacher mindset, instructor mindset, etc. That is very encouraging. But unfortunately, even in the UDL model, we see these tensions around BIPOC voices that is continuing. The first one is obvious, right? We are failing to involve Indigenous and Global South voices into the UDL discourse. We are failing in terms of our venues and our conferences. We're failing in terms of our publication and the ethnocentric sort of power dynamics that exist there. And also, I would say there's also an assumption which is really problematic, which is terribly ethnocentric, is that I've seen UDL folks say to indigenous communities, oh, well, there's a lot of synchronicity here. So we can do indigenization through UDL, right? But that is horrendous, right? It's, well, back in a post-colonial environment where I was saying UDL is going to serve, is going to be the tool and the indigeneity is going to be, the indigeneity and decolonization is going to be the master and UDL is going to be the tool, right? That should be the case, not vice versa. And those assumptions are made very systematically. Also, even when we do invite Global South scholars to the table at UDL, we kind of assume that, again, in a post-colonial way, well, everything we're doing now in North America will eventually get to you in 20 years' time, right? And that's not the case. The regional realities of what's happening in the Global South mean that UDL might look very different. And I think a lot of initiatives and a lot of really different ways of looking at UDL are coming out of the Global South, but we're not listening, right? We're not actually opening this discussion. The other way in which the UDL continues to perpetuate some of those problems is that generally, anyway, it is not a learner centered process. How much we want to say it's transformative, yes, it is inclusive, yes, it is better than some of the processes we have in place, yes. But we still make the assumption that an instructor can sit at his desk before a semester starts and hypothesize on the barriers that learners will eventually encounter, and then through UDL erode those barriers before you even walk into class. But that works well for the novice instructor, but think about what it means on the life trajectory. It means that supposedly you can solve accessibility and inclusion barriers without ever talking to students, without ever collecting that user experience, without ever engaging with a student with disability. And that's problematic, and it's growing in contradiction, but it is even worse for our BIPOC learners who are rarely invited to the table and candidly given the chance to share these life experiences. And I really, again, congratulate Navi for the work she's done, but it's rare out there. It's so within UDL, it is problematic as it's true of all learners and even more so of BIPOC learners. And finally, I just finished with the fact that even the transformative efforts that we have within accessibility and inclusion tend to be framed now these days in such a neoliberal format. And what do I mean by this is that even if you look at folks that are really advocating into this environment and for change, they are talking about branding and they apply things that are almost about, market share and spreading a model, etc. I interviewed an instructor recently through a study I was doing in Ireland, and an instructor said, oh, it would be a lot less counterproductive if they took the bling out of it, right? And he said, this is almost sold to instructors through this sort of, look at this, it's shiny out of the package, etc. And that's not what it's about. It's about a deep reflection on practice. It's a deep reflection of who you are, where you are, and what is it that you're doing, what needs to change. And we're losing that, right? Well, I'm not going to name names, but we have NGOs that are promoting UDL, etc., that are extremely sort of market focused, etc. And now this really is clashing with the essence of UDL, which was, again, a critical look, very much embedded in the social model at what we do that is not working and how we need to do it differently. So it's going to be very hard for people to take it seriously if it disconnects so much from its grassroots and from its critical origins and from looking at the social model. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing at the moment, right? And again, the victims within the casualties, the people left behind in that tension are going to be, again, BIPOC folks who should be at the heart of these discussions, not on the sides of these discussions. Take, for example, the fact that the whole UDL advocacy movement is completely indifferent to the notion of international students or folks who come from other cultures and I have other languages, and how can UDL support them? We don't talk about it ever. And that's problematic because it is directly relevant as well. Right, so that's about it. I'm now leaving us for time for questions, and hopefully there's lots of things that we can expand on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Frederick. Already such a fantastic discussion. So where I want to go next, I'm going to read, there's a couple of comments and questions for Navi in the chat, which I'm going to read. Then I have a question for both of you. And then I'm going to, if people want to start raising hands or putting questions in chats, we will kind of open this up more. So, and I'm going to try and do a couple of questions at a time. Navi had, intended this to be kind of more of a roundtable and a discussion because there's so much knowledge and advocacy in the Zoom room. So first, I'm just reading from the chat. Nalini Jacob says, "Hi, Navi. Thank you for sharing and discussing your lived experiences so openly and honestly. Your reflections highlight the real labor involved in fighting for access and will stay with me as I continue to navigate the system." Thanks, Nalini. And then Patricia Bailey Brown has a question. Navi, can you speak to whether there is any existing training for staff in accessibility services around cultural awareness? And relatedly, are there any trauma-informed or trauma-focused accessibility processes currently in place? Any thoughts you have, Navi?
Yes. Thank you for that. Cultural awareness training. I think my experience as an accessibility advisor has been that there have been directives related to equity on an institutional level. But when it comes to equity or cultural awareness, specifically as it intersects with disability, there is a lack of training related to that. And also a lack of dialogue around how, and maybe we want to expand cultural awareness to BIPOC experience, racism, ableism. And I think in an institution we can get comfortable with siloing services. So we can sometimes rely too much on the biomedical model. But then I think we're all interacting and applying our expertise to understand that nuance, but it's not formalized. So no formalized cultural awareness training. But we have had, what is colonization? What is decolonization? And those sort of larger institutional directives to build competency around this. But I think, as Frederick had mentioned, there's just that lack of discussion or critical engagement with the academic side of the nuance of that experience, how to address it within the Disability Service Office. Mm-hmm. And trauma-informed accessibility processes. I think there are professional development opportunities that are offered to staff. It's certainly something that we engage with regularly. But maybe that there's other people who can speak to in their department, like what's required. There's no requirement for this, but it's certainly something that, I grapple with often, or training that's offered periodically. I hope, Patricia, I'm not sure if I'm answering that succinctly, but the answer seems to be not specifically on both of those.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I just noticed Patricia added a comment here, identifying as a therapist working with students that this is lacking. Okay, I want to just make a comment and ask a question of both of you, and then we'll continue on collecting questions from the group. I'm just going to share this in the chat. Looks long, but I just wanted to kind of flag concepts that I really appreciate. I just wanted to kind of draw these out for the audience. I've had a chance to hear Navi's work like in detail in the past. So I love the idea of the accommodation differential. I just wanted to flag that for folks. And medical gaslighting is like, I don't even know how I I do know how confusing it was to kind of navigate that fog without the concept and to be like, oh, this is medical gaslighting. It's so helpful. And Frederick, I loved that you used the concept of institutional pendulum. We are so there right now, and the fragmentation of services. So I'm going to put a question to both of you, and I'm so excited to see the questions are heating up from everyone. So this is my one chance to ask one. So both of you, Navi and Frederick, your presentations have provided important frameworks for where we need to go next in terms of anti-racism accessibility advocacy on campus and where we need to go next in terms of anti-racist inclusive education research. That was going to be my question, but it's already answered, which I'm happy about. My question is this. Maybe could you each comment on the importance of naming anti-Black racism, ableism, colonialism, anti-Indigenous racism, ableism, as structural and ideological systems operating inside and outside of post-secondary institutions? Should we be moving away from terms such as UDL? I'm, really thinking about your comments too, Frederick. Inclusive education. I've worked and alongside Marina, actually, we've worked on several committees together using the EDI framework. And, when that fails, I feel so upset that I gave up the word anti-racism as my main, so yeah, if you have any thoughts on where we need to go as things get worse, kind of in a more of a global sense. If you'd like to comment on that, Navi and Frederick.
Navi, go ahead. We'll keep the same order. It'll be easier.
Frederick, I'm kind of still letting this turn in my mind. Do you have anything top of mind? I could
Yeah,
use an
no,
extra
I
second. Thank
can jump
you.
in definitely.
Thanks so
So I think it's a very important question that you have, and it's a dilemma that for a lot of people who are trying to be transformative in this environment and how do we choose that terminology, what implications does it have, etc. I think that there's still a need for things like UDL, EDI, inclusive education, because we have to look at our institutions as this multi-layered, complex, multi-qualification. We all come from different background or post-secondary, we're all a different place of our career, etc. And if I look as a faculty, right, which is still the body of people who are interacting with students, there's often such a lack of basic understanding, right? Basic terms, right? In terms of really accessibility, practical accessibility and practical inclusion in the classroom, that it would be dangerous to jump till the next bridge and forget that they have to cross this bridge first. So I would be an advocate for saying that we still need that conversation, right? I'm talking about decolonizing UDL, for example, and keep saying how problematic UDL is. But I do think that having every instructor go through a UDL training is something really important. I think it's not the end of the road. And I think the danger at the moment is when we say, okay, that's it. I've ticked the boxes. I've done my inclusion UDL, EDI basic training. What happens next is where those larger conversations around, anti-racism education, power dynamics in institutions, who's voiceless, who's not there, etc. That needs to continue afterwards, right? So I think it's a two-front battle where we have to make sure everyone has the basic understanding to function within particularly learning spaces and I think we can take things back to accessibility. If folks are not, given more training on UDL, they are pushing the volume onto accessibility services for things that could very well be done in the classroom, right? So it needs to be there. It needs to happen.
Yeah.
But I think we need to change again how we are framing UDL. And that again goes back to that neoliberal discourse, right? We are too tempted in our current climate to say, okay, I've done the training, I've done this, that's it, my reflection can end. And we have to make sure that UDL is positioned anyway, and not as a finite process, not as a list of prescriptive things, but as a continuing lifelong reflection on practice. So when you've done those basic things, you should be then going to the next bigger questions and the bigger issue, which are, again, I would say even critical pedagogy generally, right? And anti-racism and the power dynamics that are at play at the moment. But it does mean it's difficult because we again, in this landscape, try to want to prioritize. Is it this or is it that? Is it this or is it that? And we have to be careful too, because in this big study I finished recently, instructors saying, I can't differentiate amongst priorities. I'm juggling too many balls. I don't even understand what needs to happen with urgency and what doesn't need to
Mm-hmm.
happen with urgency, right? So that is also problematic, how we position this with faculty, right? How we explain to them the various components of these building blocks that they will have to go through.
Mm-hmm. I can see the advantage of the concept of universal design is sort of something that you can quote train. So things are happening, things shift in the classroom, and then we can still use specialized services because universal is never going to work for everybody, right? Accommodation is
Absolutely.
about kind of unique needs and at the same time kind of common barriers. And so UDL can maybe take on some of those. I do think, and you're raising that point about disability so white. We do have these, I guess, projects in name anyway around decolonizing and indigenizing the institution. I worry that these are not taken as to be essential to instructors, so that instructors like that would be nice, but whereas I think there's a bit more of a sense that there's laws backing up disability and accommodation, and I think that that's something we really are battling in terms of like putting anti-racism as central because there's so much universal stuff that happens every day in terms of microaggressions, and they're not that micro, like racism that happens every day in the classroom that is disabling, that is traumatizing, and all of that. Yeah.
But I would just quickly say a call for actions for all of us too that are operating in these environments that it is up to us now at this stage, I think, to really challenge the environment, right? I know I invited a colleague who works in anti-racism and to a conference on UDL, and she walked in and was like, am I the only black woman here? And I was like, well, yes. And so these are not comfortable conversations, but she was very willing. We need to create cross-pollination and go and challenge people in these environments that otherwise can become very safe and very comfortable, and they shouldn't be, right? We should be looking for the next frontier, the next thing to battle. And I think it's up to all of us to create that cross-pollination and to invite people into all of the different circles we're in so that we are challenged to think further.
Thanks. I see a question from iPhone 15, and then after that, I might read a couple questions depending on what this one is.
Hi,
You want to go
sorry.
ahead?
My name is Patricia. I'm sorry, I forgot to put my name in and just signed in as iPhone. But I was just kind of thinking when Nav was talking about her experience in the schools, I'm a student and I'm also dealing with like accessibility services at the school and just personal things that I'm going through. And I find that oftentimes maybe the topic of human nature could be like brought into the like conversation just because what Nav was describing was the gaslighting almost has to you have to put your pride aside saying that like you're okay and you almost have to make yourself seem more like in need than what you like feel like you maybe that's not the right words that I'm using, but in order to get the help that you need. And so I think human nature is a good topic of conversation to have just because like we all we're I approach it like we're all equal, but we have different equity. We all require different needs. And so even if somebody like I don't know, somebody might not be on the same uh like educational standpoint as me or something else, I feel like they have something else that I might not have. And so for me, that's where I find value in human connection, so on and so forth. And I find that a lot of people hold this pride to them. And maybe my question was, how do we address pride in situations like this for equity to be met? Oh, maybe that's what I was trying to say. Okay.
Lovely question. Thank you, Patricia. Navi, do you want to comment, or do you want me to read some more comments and questions?
Well, as you were talking, Patricia, I had a very similar experience and of the registration process eliciting, I forget who the theorist was who called it the culture of illness, where the narrative that's accepted to register for services elicits a specific types of narrative. It like you're requesting a specific type of narrative from the person who's registering or from the student that's accepted only through the lens of the culture of illness. So it so you're not alone and feeling like, well, if I want to get support, I have to frame it in this specific way in order to get. And I think the idea of decolonizing the process would be, how do we invite people in without, or maybe providing them space to be able to bring themselves holistically and helping them interpret or understand what eligibility looks like from more of a holistic lens. Do we have space to receive it? Do we have space to receive those commentary outside of the culture of illness?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's my initial thought there.
Just going to jump in and say also, when you are in accessibility services, there's this well-known almost phenomenon of compliance, right? That if you want to have access to your services, there's that level of compliance. As you say, your narrative have to fit a certain, and even a mannerism, right? You have to be compliant and accept what you ask and be patient and be polite. And the notion of angry BIPOC folks, right? Who right away are saying, oh, this is a difficult, this is a challenging user, right? And that's why I say, how many people walk away at that moment, right? That they never become service users, because that is the point of disconnection. And simply because from a racial point of view, we're saying, oh, these are people who are disgruntled, right? Oh, it's going to be problematic for the service. It's happening a lot. It's well documented, within the narratives of BIPOC folks who approach, right, and don't even become service users. It is really problematic how we even frame discontentment, right? What is someone who's not happy with what is provided? And then the racial lens definitely comes in there, right? How we interpret this as being something which is valid versus non-valid and problematic.
I want to springboard off of that, Frederick, something I was thinking about from your initial question, Rachel, which is, I think accessibility advisors have this very close relationship with students and also hold a very pivotal understanding and knowledge of what's happening within the institution and understand patterns of harm that are occurring, but and hear this from students, are able to aggregate that data across students, and might not be supported in addressing those things if it's outside of really anchoring it to ableism.
Yeah.
So again, the institution's only providing, support if we're able to reflect recommendations from a biomedical perspective. Well, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I'm sure different commissions across Canada, have said in complaints we are going to consider intersectionality.
Yeah.
So in that response, we should be preparing policy and process that supports integration of those perspectives from the beginning.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like it's not enough with like the culture of illness, or we need to create better systems to be able to receive these things, or at least conversations. And what I heard from BIPOC accessibility advisors is that those conversations are happening on a person-to-person basis, maybe not happening between case consults. And from students, they're receiving this positive support or more direction about navigation, language of access that's not standardized practice from accessibility advisors. And so the idea is that the BIPOC student should be having that more like those gaps should be addressed on a more systemic level.
Absolutely. And I think that Navi, your application of the concept of disablement to like specifically to looking at accessibility and accommodation is so crucial, because if people are going to say, yes, we're going to accommodate, educating folks on how white the notion of accommodation is, and just everything that Frederick just described in terms of like you have to perform a certain kind of whiteness even to get recognized. So if we all agree that we do have to deal with ableism, let's at least kind of complicate our understanding of that and shift it more towards disability justice, et cetera. I see Alessia de Virgilia's hand. I'm very excited you're here. Alessia, do you want to speak now? Hi.
Oh, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Frederick, Navi, thank you so much. Navi, I adore you. Frederick, you probably don't know this, but you presented to our college 10 years ago about UVL, and as a result, two people retired because they were so afraid of UDL. So thank you for that. Uh, um, I'm sitting here with a lot of thoughts, but I'm just sort of wondering with the question of what now? So we're hearing that BIPOC students are feeling disconnected, experiencing racism and oppression when navigating the accommodation process. At the same time, the pendulum is way to the right.
Yeah.
And we're hearing that the response from institutions to, well, students don't want to access the services because it's oppressive. The response is, well, let's just automate everything to like reduce the amount of contact that students have with the system.
Yeah.
And so there's this constant like push to navigate to automation. There's a push to depersonalization in an effort to not address what's really going on. And that's where I think a lot of students are falling through the cracks and a lot of advisors are feeling lost. And so how do we exist in this moment where the social model is being appropriated by bureaucracy in ways that are even more oppressive than they were 1 year ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah. Thanks, Alessia. Yeah. I feel very sad all of a sudden. It's, but you're naming the truth. Navi, do you want to weigh in on this?
I'm in a similar position, Alessia, where I'm asking those questions. I agree that austerity measures are co-opting radical discourse in order to provide what's being branded as radical access, but is not. Yeah. And that's where I am. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to catch up a bit on the chat, so I'm gonna read through some comments and questions that have been coming up, and yeah, we've got 10 minutes remaining, so we'll have some time to hear from responses from both of you on the panel. So Megan Murphy says, I would also be interested in knowing if there's any staff training for accessibility in UDL, both within accessibility services, but also across institutions in different areas like facilities management, communications, and other divisions across the institution. That's a great point. I mean, I just have to say from my own perspective, like getting into the nuts and bolts of trying to address actual barriers that come up for my students. I do find myself in conversations across these different divisions, like, the university I work at, well, we're being hosted right now at York, is it's very complicated, it's very large, there's a lot of departments, and we're not all on the same page. And we have next, so Sherry Lee says, having worked in K-12 for over 20 years, the term trauma-informed wasn't mentioned once. Maybe it's being trained in the last 3 years. So that was in reference to the conversation, a question around trauma-informed. Claudia says, in response to Navi's question about barriers experienced before post-secondary education, there's systemic violence, for example, classism, racism, anti-Black Zionism, Eurocentrism, colonialism. See, I love all these words are what we need to be using. These concepts are important. Disableism, ableism, sexism, xenophobia, neuronormativity, overemphasis on verbal speech-based communication, etc. Experienced in K-12 education. So these impact disclosure dynamics. So the duty to disclose, being able to register with accessibility services in post-secondary. And then Claudia continues, for example, harmful IEPs, that's just individual education program, I think. Harmful special ed programs, being pulled in and out of classes, having to go to a separate school for half a day for the special ed part, physical, verbal, emotional, sexual abuse and violence from peers, adult educators, service providers, and adult caregivers and parents as a child. That is a very important naming of kind of ableist and racist violence that folks are experiencing. And then a question, yeah, same person, Claudia says, question for BIPOC students who are falling through the cracks because they do not register with an accessibility office or services in post-secondary education due to a lifetime of systemic violence and abuse of all forms. When a student experiences challenges or difficulties during their education, in part due to the nature of the disability, and it results in punitive measures. So we have expulsion, suspension, being strong-armed into withdrawing. Again, feeling really heavy and sad reading this, but this is naming the truth. How can we work toward addressing this? I think naming it. And more from, so another final from Claudia, context. This is an example pulled from my own lived experience as a neurodivergent Black first-gen young caregiver supporting an older sibling in a graduate program at York who received a decision of expulsion despite appeal processes and being coerced into disclosing and providing medical documentation, which was invasive and ultimately deemed not relevant and insufficient because their quote diagnosis was given over 10 years ago. Keeping in mind it costs $3,000 for a new diagnosis, and because my loved one did not disclose this to their graduate supervisor, placement supervisor, and accessibility service due to all the above experiences of systemic violence and harm. Thank you very much, Claudia, for sharing that incredibly painful and very, very real experience. And the importance of naming the violence. And I think that's part of why where I get frustrated when I'm having these EDI discussions, I can't just say violence. This is the violence, right? Or it detracts us somehow from what's actually happening. Oh, this is such a good conversation. Okay, I'm going to read one more and then just see if there's any more comments to add. So Isha says, yes, this is evident with RECEs in Ontario as well, and the infamous question number 6 asked by the College of Early Childhood Educators, which asks educators to disclose any diagnosed or undiagnosed disabilities in a system where there's a lack of mental health resources for racialized and marginalized educators. Absolutely, like the ableism that service providers experience also has a huge bearing on who gets to provide the services. And Vaipanjat says, as a society, we need to understand that access is not optional. It is social, shaping how we connect, collaborate, and grow when we work together. Political challenging systems that exclude and creating true equity. Instead of expecting individuals to adjust to the environment, we should shape the environment to meet everyone's needs. Oh, I love this. I hope we can save the chat too. I'm going to pause before I read more. Navi or Frederick, do you have anything you want to add, or do you want me to keep reading?
I definitely would say that it is always a danger when we have conversations like this to leave on the negative note. And although the landscape is very concerning and very worrying, I think there are things we can do, right? So just very quickly, but when we talk about the pendulum swing, it's about not being naive. I think whatever we build, we know that that pendulum swing is there. And yes, some of things will be knocked down, but then you have to build a resilience to know that your work is longitudinal, right? And the pendulum swings, but then we go over it and we rebuild, and it's part of how systemic change in organization happens. So don't give up. It's about building resilience, right? Beyond the hurdles at the moment. Fragmentation of services. I think everyone in this chat has the possibility to reach out to someone who's in a different discipline, different service, etc. And that's built from a human perspective by creating these connections, building these bridges, creating these collaborations. the anti-Black racism, we need cross-pollination. We need to bring our colleagues into the accessibility field, into inclusion, and to make them part of the conversations. That's only going to happen if we are actually doing that, right? We invite these folks in. And then the gap between theory and practice in disability studies, I think, again, let's go back to the essence, right? Whenever I talk about UDL, I say, let's talk about social model first, right? Simple things, when you don't, so you don't get caught up on technicalities or details, but you actually go back to what is the theoretical, foundation coming from disability studies that has to inform a reflection on practice on our everyday acts. And I think if we keep to those things, there will be change, even in dark times.
And kind of on that note of how we fight, I just want to say Navi's guidebook itself is, and I've had the joy and privilege of being in conversation with Navi about this over quite a while. Navi, you envisioning this as something that students wandering in are going to pick up and see themselves reflected. And so that whole moment of alienation that we've actually been describing so much will be interrupted. Even if the student doesn't directly go and seek out an advisor, they're going to actually start to connect, and they'll realize someone, at least one person, understands what's happening, and you're starting to name things differently. Yeah, Navi. So your hopes for this guide going forward, and
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel and Frederick. Yeah, I think there are, there wasn't a lot of dialogue, and I felt very alienated through the accommodation process and didn't really understand what I could access or how to access it. So I was only accessing a very small portion of maybe what I was eligible to, because I was navigating the identity piece at the same time. So I do hope to build on how to navigate, how to ask less shame in the process, maybe even more discussion to depersonalize the process so people don't take on the shame, but say, this is something that I'm going to instrumentalize in order to receive what I need. And maybe more discussion between accessibility advisors and students, and directing and navigating students. And like Frederick had pointed out, there's a lot more work that has to be done with student associations of different groups, especially marginalized identities, to be inviting students in, or maybe providing supports outside if that's what the safe thing to do is. And so my hope is to create alternative processes within a responsibility for the Disability Service Office to be measuring these things, but also recognition that for the most part, these students aren't receiving the supports within the Disability Service Office. We need to address supporting those students without as well.
Wonderful. Congratulations, Navi, and thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you, Frederick, for your presentation, and thanks to Marina for hosting us, and all of these great comments in the chat. Like, thank you so much, and for folks who spoke. It's really beautiful to feel like I really feel a sense of community here. So, thanks to everyone for joining.
And thanks so much to Rachel for facilitating, and for all of you for participating. I mean, if this tells us anything, there's just such a need for continued forums like this and conversation. And I think just to end on that note of a call for action, I think each of us, wherever we're positioned, should be thinking about ways that we can push this forward. Right? So thank you all for coming. And watch the Mad Studies Hub website for posts about this. We will also have a link to the BIPOC guide on the website as well. So thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.